There is a moment this story wants you to see before it explains itself. Picture a dry August noon in the hill country of central Texas, the year 1893, the kind of day that makes the air shimmer above the road like the land itself is feverish. Picture a young woman standing at the edge of a limestone shelf that drops away behind her homestead, and below that shelf, catching the light like a dropped coin, a long pool of water. Still, green-dark, not 6 inches lower than it had been in March. Around her and above her, and filling every flat rock on that ledge, 80 goats are drinking. Not the tucked-ribbed, lie-eyed creatures she had loaded off a rail car 26 months ago for $27 and a handshake from a man who could not believe his luck. These are fat, steady animals, their coats the color of buckwheat honey, their small ears pivoting in the heat. And across the dry road, 300 yards away, the Callaway wheat field is a gray ruin. The Brower oat crop is ash. The creek that 24 families depended on has been a memory since June, a strip of white gravel and cracked clay with a faint mineral smell. But the pool on Clara Voss's land is full. Had always been full. She had known it would be. She had known it the morning she first crawled on her hands and knees along that limestone shelf and pressed her ear to the rock and heard, or believed she heard, the deep, patient syllable of an underground seep. And the whole town of Harlan Springs had known nothing of the kind. They had known only that Clara Voss was 22 years old, that she was alone, and that she had spent nearly every dollar she had on a pen of sick Angora goats nobody else would touch. That is where this story begins. 2 springs earlier. She had come to Harlan Springs the way most things nobody wanted came there, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone waiting. Her father's 40-acre parcel outside of town had passed to her when he died of a lung complaint in February of 1891, and the parcel was understood by everyone in the county to be near worthless. It was rocky upland ground, too thin for wheat, too steep for row crops, with a dry grass draw and a limestone shelf along the back that the previous survey had generously described as possessing limited water access. The house was a one-room board structure with a stove that drafted poorly and a roof that would need work before the next hard rain. The town assessor, a barrel-shaped man named Height, who wore his watch chain like a badge of office, had valued the land at $60 the previous year, which Clara suspected was a favor to her father's memory rather than an honest number. She arrived in March with a trunk, a crate of kitchen goods, a $10 bill folded inside her boot, and a second $10 bill sewed into the hem of her coat. She was not a woman who trusted single hiding places. The town received her with the particular kindness that is really a form of verdict. Neighbors stopped by the first week. The Brower woman brought cornbread. Old Peter Vandermeer, who farmed the river bottom acres 2 miles east, came with a jar of pickled beets and stayed for an hour, and what they said with their mouths was welcome, and what they said with their eyes was, "You will not last the year." She was too young, too slight, too alone. A woman with no husband and no brothers and no name anyone could lean on. Clara noted these opinions the way she noted the drainage patterns on her land, carefully filing them away, saying nothing. She spent the first 2 weeks walking the property, not the quick survey of someone anxious to decide and be done, but the slow, low-to-the-ground reading of a person who believes the land is saying something and knows she has to be quiet enough to hear it. She walked the dry grass draw and found that the soil there stayed damp 2 inches down, long after the surface had dried. She walked the limestone shelf and found the seep, a place where the rock was dark with wet, even in the afternoon heat, a slow weeping of cold water from some deep pressurized source that the shelf's overhang kept shaded from direct sun. She dropped a stone into the pool at the base of the shelf and listened to it strike deep water. She lay on her stomach in the dirt and peered into the shadow and saw the pool was 8 feet across and ran back under the rock further than she could see. She stood up with her dress dusty and her palms scratched and thought, "This is the thing nobody counted." What she needed, she decided that same afternoon, was an animal that could live on rough browse, tolerate dry land heat, needed almost no flat ground, and could turn the sparse cedars and scrub oak on her rocky upland into something she could sell. She had read about Angora goats in an agricultural circular she'd found in her father's papers, a newsletter out of San Antonio that described the mohair trade in careful, excited terms. The fiber, the circular said, was selling for 40 cents a pound in good years, 20 in bad ones, and a single well-bred doe, called a nanny, or more precisely, a nanny doe, could be shorn twice a year. She did the arithmetic 3 times in the lamplight that first night, her pencil moving carefully down the page. 80 goats, 2 clips a year, 3 pounds of fiber per clip, and she had 480 pounds of mohair annually if everything went right, which nothing ever did. So she halved it, and then halved it again, and came out with a number that was still better than wheat on 40 acres of rock. She heard about the Dunbar lot the following week. Silas Dunbar had brought a mixed lot of 80 Angora nannies up from the Edwards Plateau country the previous fall, intending to start a mohair operation on his hill country spread, and every one of them had gotten sick over the winter with something that made their coats rough and their eyes run and their ribs show through like barrel staves. Silas Dunbar wanted them off his land and off his account. He was asking $30, but would take less, and Clara knew it. She went to see them on a gray Tuesday morning and stood at the fence of a pen that smelled of old straw and illness, and she looked at 80 miserable goats who looked back at her with expressions of profound and personal embarrassment, and she decided they would do. She paid $27, the 10 from her boot, 12 she had saved in a coffee tin in the 3 weeks since arriving, and 5 she borrowed from old Peter Vandermeer, who gave it to her without blinking, and said only, in the thick Dutch accented plainness that was his way of speaking, "The land does not care what the goat looks like when it arrives. It cares what you do with what you are given." She held that sentence. She would hold it for the rest of her life. She loaded the 80 nannies onto a hired wagon under the skeptical gaze of Silas Dunbar's 2 farmhands, who did not trouble themselves to hide their opinion of the transaction. She heard one of them say to the other, as the wagon pulled away, "That was a fool's $27, if ever I saw one spent." Clara sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and her face forward and felt the sum of money she had left, which was precisely $11.40, and thought about what she was going to do next. What she was going to do next was save the goats. She had studied the problem of rough, illness-thinned Angora coats in the circular, and in 2 other pamphlets she had written away for from an agricultural school in Austin, and she believed the trouble was a combination of mineral deficiency and a stomach parasite, common in overcrowded pens. The cure was not mysterious. It was sulfur blocks for the minerals, a rotation of pasture ground to break the parasite cycle, clean water, and time. She had the sulfur blocks within a week, hauling them from the Harlan Springs feed store in a wheelbarrow, while the store's proprietor, a man named Gruber, watched her pay for them with the careful attention of someone observing a miscalculation in progress. She had the pasture rotation. She divided her rocky upland into 4 rough sections and moved the goats week by week, keeping them off each section long enough to let the cycle break. And she had the water. The pool behind the limestone shelf, fed by its underground seep, gave her 40 gallons a day without diminishing. She had measured it. She had dropped a marked stake and watched it for 2 weeks, and the level did not drop. The land was giving her one true thing, and she was going to use it. The town watched all of this with the comfortable certainty of people who have already reached their conclusion. The story of the $27 sick goat purchase had made its rounds in approximately 4 days, which was the standard time for any story in Harlan Springs, and the consensus was both swift and nearly unanimous. Clara Voss was going to lose her money, her father's land, and probably her health, and probably in that order. She would be gone by winter. There was no meanness in this verdict for the most part. It was simply what the arithmetic seemed to say to people who had not done the arithmetic Clara had done. Old Peter Vandermeer had done something like it, though. He came by on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after she had brought the goats home, stepping carefully through the gap in the cedar fence she had patched with wire and good intentions, and he stood at the edge of the pasture and looked at the Nannies for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "The ears are coming up." Clara looked. The goats that had arrived with their ears hanging like wilted leaves were holding them higher. She had not noticed. She had been too close to it. "You see more when you know where to look," Peter said, and left. She counted better ears the next morning and found that 63 of the 80 were carrying their heads differently than they had a month ago. It was not nothing. It was the arithmetic working. By June of 1891, 3 months after the goats had come to the property, Clara had learned their personalities in the way you learn such things when you spend 6 hours a day among a creature and pay attention. The lead nanny, a broad-faced animal with a dark patch above her left eye, had appointed herself arbiter of every dispute in the herd and could be relied upon to appear wherever 2 goats were quarreling and stand between them with an air of considerable self-importance. Clara called her magistrate. The smallest goat, barely half the size she should have been, had taken to following Clara from pen to gate to water trough with a devotion that was less loyalty than an absolute confidence that Clara was in possession of food at all times. Her name became Pocket. The rest of the 80 she named over the course of that spring, all 80, a fact that Peter Vandermeer received with a silence that took her a moment to recognize as suppressed amusement. "It is good," he said finally, "to know who you are working with." By August, the coats were changing. The rough, brittle fiber that had hung off the Dunbar lot like old rope was growing out, the new growth coming in beneath it, soft as a whisper, white and fine, and with the particular silky draft of good Angora mohair that the circular had described in near reverent terms. Clara pulled a small sample from the edge of a nanny's fleece, they were not due for shearing until the following spring, and rolled it between her fingers and felt the quality of it. She said nothing to anyone. She banked that knowledge like a coal under ash and let it burn quietly, keeping herself warm. The first shearing came the following March, the spring of 1892. Clara had practiced on a neighbor's sheep the previous fall, embarrassing work that she did not mind being embarrassed by, because learning the technique mattered and pride did not. And she hired Peter Vandermeer's grandson, a broad-shouldered 16-year-old named Keyes, who had sheared in the hill country before, to work alongside her for 3 days. Together they moved through all 80 nannies, and when the fiber was bagged and weighed, Clara sat with the figures at her table by the stove and looked at them for a long time. 412 pounds of mohair. She had calculated 200 as the realistic floor. She had gotten 412. She closed the ledger. She opened it again. The number had not changed. She shipped the fiber through a wool and mohair broker in San Antonio, a man named Aurelio Garza, recommended by the Agricultural Circular, who dealt in fine fiber and was known in the trade for honest weights and fair settlement. She did not know what to expect from the price. Mohair had been running between 25 and 40 cents a pound, depending on grade and market, and she had no firm sense of where her clip would land. What she received 3 weeks after the shipment was a letter from Aurelio Garza that contained 2 things: a bank draft for $153.40 and a single sentence of commentary written in a neat, careful hand. "The grade of this clip is exceptional. I do not know your operation, but I would be grateful to receive whatever you send next year." She read the sentence twice. She set the letter down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. $153.40. She had paid $27 for the animals. She had paid $11 more in feed and sulfur and wire through the year. She had paid Keyes $4 for 3 days shearing, She had paid the broker his commission already deducted, and she had $153.40 on the table in front of her and 80 healthy Angoras standing in the upland pasture waiting to grow another clip. It is worth noting what Clara did with the money because it tells you something about how she reasoned. She did not buy comfort. She bought the property outright, paid the $60 assessment to Height the assessor, who received the payment with an expression she could not fully read, some blend of surprise and something she thought might be reluctant respect. She repaid Peter Vandermeer his $5 with an additional $3 of interest that he tried to refuse and that she left on his fence post anyway. She spent $14 on fencing material to expand the rotational pasture system. She kept the rest, every dollar of it, filed carefully in the coffee tin, which had by now been joined by a second coffee tin, this one kept under a loose board in the floor because, as noted, Clara did not trust single hiding places. By that summer, the town of Harlan Springs had noticed that Clara Voss was still on her land. This was itself a notable fact, given what everyone had known about the situation. Nobody said outright that they had been wrong. That is not how towns speak. But the nature of the greetings she received on her infrequent trips into town had shifted subtly, the way weather shifts, in a direction that indicated some internal revision was underway. Gruber at the feed store had stopped watching her count out money with that particular expression. The Brower woman, whose husband farmed the wheat ground directly across the road, stopped letting her eyes do the arithmetic of Clara's chances every time they passed. There was one exception. His name was Horace Krell, and he was the kind of man who appears in every small market town in that era, occupying the precise space between legitimate commerce and something less flattering. A livestock and land broker who moved between buyers and sellers and kept more than a fair portion of the difference, who wore good clothes in a persuasive manner and had the eyes of someone perpetually calculating. Horace Krell had, Clara would later learn, already approached 2 other small landholders in the county about selling out, always at assessor value or below, always with the smooth implication that the assessed value was generous under the current conditions and the offer might not stand. He came to Clara's fence in June of 1892 wearing his good hat and a smile that had been designed to make people feel, briefly, that they were being done a favor. He said he had heard she had been having a hard time of it and had wondered if she had considered selling the parcel, that the hill country land was thin and dry, years were coming, and a woman alone could not be expected to manage it indefinitely, and he was prepared to offer her $80, which was more than the assessed value, which he hoped she could see was a generous act of community feeling. Clara listened to all of this, standing at her fence with her hands loose at her sides and her face pleasant, and at the end of it she said, "I appreciate you coming out, Mr. Krell, and I expect I will stay on." Horace Krell's smile did not change exactly, but something behind it rearranged. He said the offer would remain open, and she said, "Thank you," and he left. She told Peter Vandermeer about the visit that evening. The old man sat in the chair she kept on her porch for him and turned his hat in his hands and said, "A man who wants your land before your land shows what it is worth to him. That man will come back." She thought about that. She watched the road. She kept working. The second shearing, the spring of 1893, produced 461 pounds, which she attributed to the continuing health of the herd, the good second-year condition of the pasture rotation, and the fact that 3 of the does had freshened over the winter. She had purchased a good Angora buck the previous fall, a lean, dignified animal she named Senator, bringing the effective herd to 83 animals once the kids were weaned onto browse. Aurelio Garza wrote again that the grade was exceptional, that he was placing it with a woolen mill in Philadelphia that was paying a premium for consistent fine fiber clips, and the draft that arrived this time was $218. She sat with that number and felt, not triumph exactly. Triumph was a word that imagined an audience, and she had done this work without one, but a quiet, deep satisfaction, the satisfaction of an equation balancing exactly as you had reasoned it should. Then July came, and the sky turned the wrong color. The old-timers in the hill country said afterward that the summer of 1893 was the worst dry spell in 40 years, and the old-timers were not exaggerating for once. The rain stopped in late June and did not return. By the middle of July, the creek that ran along the east edge of the county, the water source that the Calloway family, the Brower family, and 4 other farms along its bank depended on, was down to ankle depth and dropping. The grass burned off the flat ground. The wheat that had been put in late on the Calloway parcel shriveled in the furrow. A communal well in the town of Harlan Springs dropped to 12 feet and was drawing rope in the heat. By August, which arrived like the open door of a furnace and did not close again, there were cattle standing at dry creek beds with their heads down, and the mood of the town had grown quiet in the way that the mood of people grows quiet when they are genuinely frightened. Clara's pool did not drop. She had been watching it since the drought began, dropping her marked stake at first light each morning and recording the level in the back of her ledger in small, careful numbers. The seep kept feeding it. The limestone shelf kept it shaded. The pool was holding at approximately the same level it had maintained all through the dry springs of 1891 and 1892, because it was fed not by rainfall on the surface, but by the deep pressurized aquifer that the shelf tapped, a geological fact that Clara had guessed at from the day she first pressed her ear to the rock, and that she had since confirmed, as well as a woman with a pamphlet on Texas geology and a sharp eye could confirm it, by noting that the water temperature was constant through summer and winter, which was the signature of deep ground water and not surface collection. The land had been telling her this in the only language land speaks, which is the language of what persists when everything else fails. She had learned to listen. Her goats had been drinking from it all summer. The browse on her rocky upland was sparse but not gone. Cedars and scrub oak keep their leaves in dry weather, and angoras can thrive on what a sheep or a milk cow would reject. The herd was thin but steady, magistrate still maintaining order, pocket still underfoot, the rest of them working the slope from dawn to mid-morning, and sheltering in the cedars through the worst of the afternoon heat. It was the 3rd week of August when the first of her neighbors appeared at her fence. It was the Brower boy, 14 years old, Hannes, a serious and self-contained child who had sometimes helped her carry feed from the road. And he came on foot in the morning heat without a hat, which told her the errand was urgent enough that he had forgotten it. He said the Brower cattle were dying. He said the creek was stone dry. He said his father was too proud to come himself, but had sent him to ask whether Mrs. Voss, the boy had started calling her Mrs. without being corrected, which was a form of respect Clara had decided to accept without comment, whether she had any water she could spare. She told him to bring the cattle. She told him to bring his family. She showed him the path around the cedar brake to the shelf and the pool, and she watched his face when he saw the water. It was the face of someone revising a large number of assumptions at the same time. She recognized the look. It was good to see it. The Brower cattle came that afternoon, and the day after that, the Calloway family appeared at her gate, and the day after that, a woman named Dora Pacheco, who kept a kitchen garden and 6 dairy goats on the south side of town, asked if she might bring her animals, and Clara said yes. She did not ask payment. She did not charge. She had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was clear. The pool was producing more than her herd required, and the seep would not be exhausted by reasonable use, and the people around her were genuinely in distress. The generosity cost her nothing she could not afford, and the alternative, to watch her neighbor's animals die at a dry creek while her pool sat in the cedars, was not something her arithmetic had ever entertained. It was during this same period that Horace Krell came back. He came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of August, and this time he did not wear the generous expression. This time he had a man with him, a county-level clerk named Soames, who carried a folder of documents, and Horace Krell said he was concerned about the impact on his own land interests of the water-sharing arrangement Clara was operating without formal water rights documentation, and that there was a question of whether the pool on her property, which he had learned about, he said, from general conversation, represented a water source that she legally owned, or one that the county might have some claim to, given that it appeared to draw from a regional aquifer, and that he had taken the liberty of raising the question with the county assessor's office. And perhaps it would be in everyone's interest for her to sell the land while the question was being reviewed. He put the price at $90. He said it was a final number. Clara stood at her gate and let him finish. She was aware of the Brower boy, Hannes, who was watering the cattle 20 yards behind her, and had gone very still at the sound of Horace Krell's voice. She thought of what Peter Vandermeer had said. A man who wants your land before it shows what it is worth to him will come back. He had not said what to do when the man came back, but she had thought about it. She said, "Mr. Krell, I have the original survey from 1879, which I have had cause to study, and the water source on the shelf is documented as a private spring within the parcel boundaries, not a surface waterway subject to county or riparian claim." She said the Agricultural Bureau in Austin had provided her, by letter, with a confirmation of that classification when she had written to ask, which she had done in June, 2 months before this conversation. She looked at the clerk Soames when she said this. She watched him look at his folder, and then look at Krell, and then look at his folder again. She said she would be staying on, and that the $90 was not something she would be accepting, and that if Mr. Krell had a genuine concern about the survey documentation, he was welcome to write to the Agricultural Bureau himself, but she expected he would find the same letter she had found. She said this pleasantly. She said it the way you say something when you are very sure of the ground under your feet. Horace Krell's face went through several arrangements before it settled on something neutral. He said he supposed that was her right. She said it was. He left. He did not come back again. Peter Vandermeer came by that evening, having heard about the visit from Hannes Brower, who had apparently given a thorough account to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it. The old man sat in his chair on the porch and looked at the pool shining in the late light below the shelf, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You wrote to Austin in June." Clara said yes. "He said you saw him coming that far back." She thought about how to answer that and finally said, "He was always going to come back for the water once the drought showed it. I just wanted to be ready." Peter Vandermeer turned his hat in his hands and said, "The land does not care what the goat looked like when it arrived. It cares what you do with what you are given." She had heard him say this before. She heard it differently now. By September, the rains had not yet returned, but the county was managing the Brower cattle and the Callaway stock, and Dora Pacheco's goats, all watering from the pool in rotation. Clara keeping an informal schedule on a slip of paper tacked to her fence post so that no one arrived at the same hour and the pool had time to fill between visits. She charged nothing. She had been offered money by the Callaway father, a proud, stiff-spined man, who found charity difficult, and she had said she did not want money, that she wanted him to remember that the goats on the rocky ground had kept the pool open, and that the next time anyone in the county was thinking about what was worth something and what was not, she hoped the goats would come to mind. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Fair enough, Mrs. Voss," and she had accepted that. Aurelio Garza came in October. He drove out from San Antonio himself, which he had apparently never done for a supplier before, to see the operation that was producing the Philadelphia-bound fiber. He was a small, precise man with good boots and an expression of habitual professional calm that cracked slightly when he stepped around the cedar break and saw the pool, the shelf, the 83 goats working the slope above it, in the thin autumn light. He said, "I did not expect this country." She asked him what he had expected. He said something more obvious, I think. something easier to see. She took him through the pasture rotation and showed him the shearing records and the fiber weights, and he made notes in a small book and asked careful questions. And before he left, he said he wanted to offer her a 3-year contract at 42 cents a pound, which was above the current market, in exchange for the full clip first right of purchase. She looked at the number for a moment and said 40 cents, and the right to sell the surplus clip herself in any year the clip exceeded 500 pounds, which she expected next year it would. Aurelio Garza looked at her and then smiled, a real smile, not the professional kind, and said he had not expected to be negotiating upward, and that yes, 40 cents and a surplus clause was acceptable, and they shook hands at the gate in the October light. She walked back to the house afterward and sat at her table and opened her ledger and worked the 3-year contract forward in pencil. The numbers were steady, solid, the kind of numbers that meant she was not going anywhere. The land was not going anywhere. The pool under the shelf would be there in the morning and the morning after that, doing what it had always done, the quiet, invisible work of the thing nobody had counted. Winter came slowly that year, the drought breaking in late October, with 3 days of soft, steady rain that brought Hannes Brower running to her gate just to tell her the creek was running again, as though she might not have noticed, his face bright with the particular relief of a boy who has been frightened and then been given his fear back. She thanked him for coming. She gave him a jar of the pickled beans she had put up in September, which he received with the solemnity appropriate to a significant gift. He became a regular presence on the property after that, arriving on Saturday mornings to help with the water carrying and the fence checking and whatever else wanted doing, and Clara paid him in food and in the kind of patient sideways instruction that does not announce itself as instruction, but that a sharp child absorbs completely. He learned the pasture rotation. He learned the shearing technique from Kees Vandermeer. He learned to read the pool's level without being told why the reading mattered, and one March morning he came to her at the kitchen door and said the level was up 3 inches overnight, and she said, "That means the aquifer recharged from the October rains," and he thought about that for a long time, and then said, "So a wet winter means a dry summer doesn't drain it." She said that was correct. He thought about it some more. "Good," he said finally, with the grave satisfaction of someone filing a useful fact. Peter Vandermeer came less often that second winter. His joints were troubling him, the cold settling into old places. But he came enough, and when he came, he sat in his chair and looked at the goats and drank the coffee she kept ready for him and said the things he said, the gnomic accurate things about land and patience and worth that she had begun to understand were not general wisdom so much as specific curriculum delivered to her across a fence post and a cup of coffee over the course of 2 years, because he had seen what she was and what the land was, and had decided, without announcement, to give her what he knew. She was grateful for this in a way she did not have adequate words for, and so she expressed it in the way she expressed most things, in the coffee kept ready, in the chair on the porch, in the careful attention she paid to everything he said. By the spring of 1894, when the third shearing came and produced 509 pounds of fine Angora clip, and the Garza surplus clause was triggered for the first time, and Clara sold the overage to a second broker at 38 cents, and received, between the two settlements, $231. By that spring, the town of Harlan Springs had completed the internal revision that had been underway since the drought. The completion was not announced. Towns do not announce their revisions any more than they admit their original verdicts. But the texture of how people spoke to Clara Voss in the Harlan Springs General Store, at the post, on the road between her fence and the Brower place, had changed in a way that did not require announcement. It was the difference between being spoken to as someone temporary and being spoken to as someone who belongs. She had not sought it. She had not needed it exactly. But she found she was glad of it, in the quiet way you're glad of warmth after a long, cold season. Horace Krell had, by that spring, left Harlan Springs. The specific circumstances of his departure were various and somewhat intricate. There was a matter of a land title dispute in the neighboring county, and a question about his representation of the Callaway parcel in a sale the previous year. But the short version is that the community had taken a thorough look at how he operated once it had a reason to look, and what it found did not encourage his remaining. Clara did not feel satisfaction at this, precisely. She felt something more like the neutral confirmation of a prediction. A man who wants what you have before you know what it is worth is not ultimately very different from a drought. He reveals the thing he was trying to take. He clarifies what you have. In October of 1894, Peter Vandermeer died. He died on a Monday morning in his own bed, which was what he had wanted, and he was 81 years old, which was older than almost anyone in the county had managed, and his grandson Keyes inherited the river bottom farm and the jar of pickled beets that was perpetually being refilled, and the old chair on Clara's porch, which she kept where it was. She went to the funeral and stood at the back of the church in Harlan Springs and felt the specific weight of losing someone who had believed in you before you had given them proof. That weight does not leave. It becomes part of the load you carry, and the carrying of it is a form of thanks. She carried it forward. The fourth shearing, the spring of 1895, would eventually become the figure that people in the county cited when they talked about what could be done on the rocky upland ground that no one had wanted. 540 pounds of clip, Senator having done his work diligently, and the herd now at 91 animals, and healthy in a way that showed in their step and their fiber and their general demeanor. Magistrate still arbitrating disputes at age 5 with undiminished self-importance, pocket still underfoot, the newest members of the herd still learning the rotation schedule as all the previous new ones had. Led to water by the lead nanny down the cedar brake path to the limestone shelf and the pool that the drought had not taken. The pool that a 22-year-old woman had pressed her ear to the rock to hear in the thin March light of 1891, before she had $1 in hand or a goat on the land, or a single person in Harlan Springs who thought she was anything other than a temporary arrangement. She was 26 now. She owned the land outright, clear of any assessor's hold. She had 2 full coffee tins and a ledger with numbers that ran reliably in the right direction. She had a herd of 91 goats she could name from 50 yards in the morning light. She had a chair on the porch that meant something. She had a boy who came on Saturdays and was learning, without being told he was learning, everything she knew about what the land says and how to listen. She had a contract with a man in San Antonio who wrote in his small, precise hand that the grade was exceptional, and she expected he would write the same thing next October. The town of Harlan Springs did not say it had been wrong. Towns rarely do. What it said, in the language of people stopping to talk at the fence, in the language of children sent to her door when a ewe was sick and someone thought she might know the remedy, in the language of a space saved for her at the back of the church in October of 1894 that had not been saved the year before. What it said in all of that was that she was here and had been here and was plainly going to remain here, on the 40 acres of rocky upland ground with the pool behind the shelf that the drought had not touched, and that the goats on the slope were not the sick and stupid animals a man had been relieved to be rid of for $27, but were something else entirely, and had perhaps always been something else entirely, and perhaps the land had always been something else entirely, and perhaps the difference between what a thing appears to be and what a thing actually does. That gap, that persistent, generative gap, was worth keeping in mind the next time something arrived quietly, without ceremony, without anyone waiting, and asked only to be given a chance and a fair count. The land does not care what the goat looks like when it arrives. It cares what you do with what you are given. That is what Peter Vandermeer said. That is what the ledger, in the end, confirmed.